welcome everybody today. It gives me a huge delight to be here really, because I've been coming to this library since I was a child, and it's one of my favourite places really, because it's always been a haven for a lot of people, but this is also a beautiful building, and like Angelina said, it's 100 years since it's been here, so it's great to be here at the Writeidea store. As Angelina's introduced me, I am Julie Begum. I am a volunteer with the Shahida Trust, and we had our birthday on the 4th of November. We're 22 years old, and we've been going since the year 2000 promoting Bengali culture and heritage to young people. So it gives me great pleasure really to be here to share the work that Shahida's been doing. So Shahida Rahman is a writer. And she's been writing for a long time now, and this is her second historical novel. I'm just going to read out a little bit about her. It's in your handouts, but I just thought we should have a look at it, because she's born and brought up in Cambridge, but her work speaks to people from all sorts of backgrounds. She writes historical fiction, non-fiction and children's stories, and focuses on South Asian history and culture and heritage. So she wrote a book about 10 years ago called Lascars, and I think you said, we had a conversation this morning, it was the start of her journey to writing historical fiction, and 10 years later we've got the Ayah's Choice, and I've recently read it. That's the copy that I've just brought back to the library. So hopefully Shahida will be reading from it as well. Her first novel was inspired by a paternal ancestor, and like many people of Bengali heritage, a lot of our relatives would have come as Lascars or Ayahs or whatever, hundreds of years, over 100 years ago. So it's really important that we have a way of relating to that experience. And I think what Shahida's work does is helps us connect in a way that we probably wouldn't from in other ways. And so she's contributed widely to online publications. She's a member of the Women's Studies Association, blogged for Huffington Post UK, spoken on the radio, and a winner of awards for British Muslim Awards in 2015. So it gives me really great pleasure to welcome you. I'm aware of her work, so it's really great to meet her in person. And I'd like to start by asking you to maybe share something from the book, if you'd like, or whatever you'd like to say really about the book.
Sure, yes. No, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So this is my second book, An Ayah's Choice. And I'd just like to ask you all a question. Does anyone know who Ayahs were? Yes. Which is good, because a few years ago, if I'd asked that question, I don't think anyone knew who these women were. So my first draft I wrote in 2014, so it's taken me a long time to eventually get this published. So this story tells the story of an Indian ayah. Ayahs were nannies who took care of British children in the 1900s, and I wrote about one woman's story. She's 19 years old. She is employed by a British family in India, and then she travels to England with the family, and it's her story of her struggles, her independence, and the life that she had. Now, historical fiction, generally, if I like to explain, is, I think they're real events. Okay, this story, could have been or would have been, but the characters in any historical fiction novels, they would be true. But the events, something about historical fiction is you can let your imagination run wild a little bit. But the historical fiction, the facts have to be absolutely accurate. So I think that's the beauty of writing these kind of stories, where you can educate people in a different way, make it entertaining. So I wouldn't say it's a history book. That is not what historical fiction is about, but you would understand about the characters, the era, at the time, what it would have really been like. So, and the reason why I did write An Ayah's Choice, and also my first book, Lascar, is to bring out that history. And at that time, in 2012, when my first book came out, I said to myself, well, this is, his hidden histories. A lot of people didn't know who Lascars were. They were Asian seamen who travelled on British steamships. And so for me, I was passionate about bringing those stories out. Also being from a Bengali background, I was born and raised in Cambridge. My father came in the 50s, he settled there. And we just by passing once, my mother said, well, we had an ancestor who worked on a steamship. And I said to her, this was about 12 years ago, and I said, well, you never mentioned that to us, ever. And then I did some research, and I thought, well, we've not heard about these men before. There was thousands of men who came from East India at the time, who were employed on British steamships to ferry back cargo, such as tea, coffee, sugar, porcelain, that kind of, they helped with the shipping trade. And so I thought, well, the best way of educating people and to get the story out is to write it as a fictional novel. So it took 10 years for my second novel to come out. It really did take a long time just to get that story right. And I think the pandemic, when we went into lockdown, and that sort of instigated me to finally finish it, and I did. So this story is for you, for people like you who are interested in history and also historical fiction. So that's how the story began, really.
Yes, and just to add to that, I came across a character called Abdul in the London Museum of Docklands, who was wandering around Sailor Town. They've got this gallery called Sailor Town. And I'd never come across anyone like that in the heritage sector before that represented the lives or the stories of the people that I could have had a connection to. And so things like that, when you come across those encounters, you think, well, how did he get here? There was also another man called Jeremiah Johnson who wore a ship on his head, a man from the Caribbean. These things happened. These were men and women who would have walked the streets of London, engaged with people, and would have had lives here. So it's really important that we connect to them in some way, because they're invisible in the history books.
Absolutely. And I just want to say with my first book, Lascar, it was based in Whitechapel. This is where the history lies. And I think since that book came out, I've had a lot of engagement with that. People saying, well, we didn't know about these men. And how would you know about these if they're not written in history books and as fictional novels? You may recall a few years ago, there was a theatre play about Lascar. So that just came out just after my book was published. But now we're seeing more engagement, more understanding of Asian culture, history and heritage. And the
connection between Britain and the rest of the world. Because these were really important relationships based on trade, economics, exploitation, different reasons, but they involve real people. And it's really important to illustrate that through the lives of the people that would have been a part of that story.
Yeah, and that's what I focus on with my stories. So you can see what kind of life they would have had.
Yes.
What kind of people they would have been, the people that they engaged with. But with Indian Ayahs, I think recently there was the Ayahs home in Hackney, and Blue Plaque was unveiled.
That's right.
That was 24th of June, I think, this year.
Yes.
And that really brought a lot of attention about, these women were there, they lived there. But they all had difficult lives. They had their challenges. And as with any foreign people who arrived in England at the time, they experienced prejudice and all sorts of struggles. So that is all included, in my books for people to understand that life wasn't as easy as what people would have made it out of. So.
Yes. And we have to also thank people like Rosina Vishram, who were critical in documenting the lives of Black and Asian people who came. She was a history teacher, and I think her book, Lascars, Ayahs and Princes, was one of the first books I read about South Asian history in Britain. And that was really one of the first books that looked at that experience. So we owe a lot to people like that, really. And it was on the back of her work that research has been done about Ayahs and Lascars and other people. And you're right, the Blue Plaque was commemorated earlier this year, and she was there at the event. And the Hackney Museum had small but mighty exhibition about ayahs, and it was a home for ayahs and ammas. So ayahs were the Indian women, and ammas were the Chinese women that came from China as well. So Britain, was involved in trade all over the world. So there were women from all over the world living in the ayah's home.
Yes, absolutely. And just one story I wanted to tell you there. Ayahs, they did travel from India to England numerous times, and most of them were either elderly women, they were widows. But for them to leave India, it was seen as a taboo.
Yes.
They lost their reputation because of that. Crossing the Black Sea, it was the Kalapani, they used to say.
Yes, for Hindus, they lost their caste, actually, when they left India.
Yeah, and so they sacrificed their lives, but they wanted to work,
Yes.
as nannies,
They
which
needed to.
yes, absolutely, because India at the time, experiencing famine, all sorts of issues. But there was one lady, Mrs. Anthony Pereira, who supposedly had travelled 54 times
Goodness
back
gracious.
from England to India. No one can really get that historical, accurate figure, whether she did do, but all these stories did circulate. But she was very passionate, she wanted to take care of children. But many were abandoned when they arrived in England. That's another story where, okay, they worked as nannies, they took care of young children, and then these children were sent to boarding schools, and then they lost their jobs and they were abandoned. So these women, their struggles started there. What did they do? That some wanted to return home, they looked for journeys home, and it was very, very difficult for them, and they experienced prejudice and all sorts. But then the Ayah's home opened to accommodate for these women, and the Chinese ammas as well.
Yes.
And it was similar to Lascars as well, where
Yes.
the Lascars' home, the strangers' home, was opened.
The seaman's.
Absolutely, to take care of them. But they did have that connection, Lascars and Ayahs, and they did come across each other. But I think the journey from India to England used to take about 3 to 4 months, I would say. And they did experience, some of them, violence, sexual assaults as well. But these stories we don't really hear about. So we don't have enough information about their lives on the ships. And I think there needs to be further research on that. There just isn't enough accurate records about, the lives that they led on ship. So I'm hoping that one day, this will all come out. We'll find something. But for me, with Lascars, I would love to see a photo of a Lascar in Victorian London Street, which to this day, there isn't one. We see illustrations, we see drawings of how they're depicted, but we don't have real photos. So, but we have diaries, we can see the lives that they led, and the Old Bailey online, you can see the cases there. Some ayahs they took their employers to court because they were mistreated. Some of their property was stolen from them. So for me, when I did the research, I got all this information and tried to understand their mindset and what they actually went through. So yeah, there's still so much information yet to be found. But for me, I felt I had to write a story for people to understand who ayahs were.
Would you like to read something from the book to give us a sense of what the story's like? Would that be okay?
Yes. So I'm going to let me have a look. Okay. Do you want me to start at the front? It might be better rather than
why
in
not?
the middle. Yes.
It gives
So
people
this
a taste of what's
right.
Yes.
Okay. So this starts.
An outline of the book.
Yes.
Okay.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yes, so let me just read the synopsis here. So it's underpinned by true events. And Ayah Choice draws into a rarely unseen aspect of British Indian history, following the momentous life of Jaya Devani, that's the character of my story, an Indian woman harbouring a secret that propels her to find her own agency against a backdrop of sex, class, and race discrimination. So this story is about Jaya. She's 19 years old. She has a relationship with her employer. And that was quite common in those days. But most of it was hidden, obviously, with a scandal like this coming out. But it was common. And it was something where people just didn't want to talk about. You wouldn't talk about that kind of thing. So it's set in 1900s, and it tells the story of her independence and freedom. And at that time, India was going through a time where they were looking for independence and freedom. And also, Jaya gets involved with the suffragette movement here in England. So it's a mixture of all sorts. For me, it's independence and freedom. It's her story, and it's the story of India as well. So would you like me to read? Yes. Okay. So chapter 1. And it starts in Kasar, India, the Bihar state, in 1900. So Margie's voice faded as Jaya sprinted toward temporary freedom. So Margie was her mother. It's an Indian word for mother. Her satchel thudding against her back, sweat pooling at the base of her neck. She turned the corner and ran away to her village, to her secret spot by the river. Once she could no longer hear the shrill sound of her mother's voice, she ducked under the branches of the tree that blocked her hiding spot from those passing along the dirty road. She scrambled over the forest floor, taking care not to put her foot down on a snake, and climbed down to the thick curved root where she rested her feet as she sat relieved on the sun-dappled border. When she set her satchel on the rock a bit too hard, she saw silver flashes of a school of flingering fish dashing off the ripples of the clear river. She sighed as she pulled out her drawing book and her stick of charcoal. So Jaya was an artist, but the story starts in India and then it moves on to the ship, and there's a lot of drama on the ship, and then she moves to England. So I hope that you will want to read the book, but it will teach you a lot about their lives at that time.
I wanted to start off with asking you about what the value of historical fiction is in learning about history, and what you think has been your journey.
So as I said earlier, it's about education, it's entertainment, it's history, told in a different way, because people don't pick up history books. It's only if you need it for reference or you want to find out more about something. But historical fiction really is quite broad, and you can create a story based on historical facts and make it interesting. So I think that's the beauty of telling a story in a different way and also entertaining, because with historical fiction you have to be careful not to make it into a history book. It's not about history, it's about entertaining somebody and keeping them interested, in the story. Yes, absolutely, because otherwise your imagination can run wild. You think you've got to have that balance. It's not a history book, but it's historical fiction. So I've been very, very passionate about writing historical fiction. I'm also working on my third book. It won't take 10 years this time. I'm hoping very, very soon. But South Asian history, because I'm from an Asian background and I have that understanding of South Asian history. And I'm just very, very passionate about bringing out these kind of histories and bringing it to an audience, to those people who don't understand the history, who want to learn about the culture, the heritage. So it all comes together. So that's what it's about.
So Jaya doesn't just make one choice, she makes several choices, and you use those choices really to drive the plot in the novel. Can you talk about some of the choices that Jaya ends up making that sort of propels the story in the way that you have?
So the first part, where Jaya isn't sure whether to leave home to work as a nanny for an English family. Her mother wants to marry her off, to have an arranged marriage. So she's sort of torn between the two. Should she go off with the family to go to England, new life, new place? Absolutely. And it was very, very tempting. But whether she should stay behind, listen to her mother's wishes, and get married off. Her father passed away at a young age. But she makes that bold decision. Her mother isn't very happy with that. And then she travels to England. And then when she comes here, she has a relationship during that time with her employer. But then she realizes she's just nothing really. You know, she's just working there. She's not respected in the way that she should be. He obviously, William, he wouldn't leave his wife. So what should she do next? You know, she wanted that freedom. She felt she was trapped. So she gets involved with the suffragette movement. So at the time, women were campaigning for the right to vote. Women over 30 finally got the vote in 1918. And if I can touch on the film Suffragette, which came out in 2015, and I was quite surprised to see there wasn't an Asian woman, you know, in the background being involved in that movement, campaigning. And there were women at the time, but they were sort of in the background.
Whitewashed, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was quite surprised not to see maybe just one Indian woman standing in the back or anything like that.
Or even in the London streets.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, they did fight for their freedom. You know, they had all these struggles. And Helen Pankhurst, who kindly reviewed the book, and she was, you know,
she's
absolutely...
She's the granddaughter, isn't she?
Yes, great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst.
Yes.
And I met her a few years ago, and it was the centenary of the East London
That's right.
It was many years ago now, it was 2014. But she did say, yes, there were Indian women involved, but we don't hear much about them. But there aren't any accurate records to show that these women were there. But in 1911, the King George V had his coronation procession, and there was an image which is at the Museum of London to show Indian women all dressed in saris at the procession.
And Edwardian dress.
Absolutely, which was quite interesting to see, you know, with the long gown and the hats. But they were struggling for their freedom, for their independence, and what was happening back home in India. So, you know, lots of things going on. So I wanted to touch on that suffragette story because it would fit quite well with, you know, when we're talking about independence and freedom. But I think it was in the 1950s when women finally got the vote in India. It took many, many years for that to happen. So yes, it's a lot of drama. Someone gets murdered on the ship. I won't tell you who. I'd like you to find out about that. So yes, it's. I hope through my work that people will understand more now about these Indian women and who they were. But there's lots of photos out there, which is, you know, really interesting photos of ayahs, and it really, you know, you can tell by looking at them whether you can see the struggles in their faces and the lives that they actually had and they led at the time.
You mentioned your research. What kind of research did you do for your book or the books that you've written about ayahs and lascars?
So I think the first thing I did look at was, you know, diaries. Were there any sort of recorded diaries?
From the people themselves?
Yes, from the people themselves. And as I said earlier, the Old Bailey online, there were cases recorded of ayahs taking their employers to court, even ayahs being taken to court, and what they actually went through. And because many of them sort of didn't speak very good English, very broken English, they were taken advantage of. So it's just looking at records of some information about their lives, really, and the photos, because photos always speak for themselves. You know, you don't need that text, you know, around photos. You can just tell by looking at them, where ayahs actually date back much earlier, where you see, I think some members of the royal family, over 200, 300 years ago, they had an ayah who took care of them. And to this day, when I go around and I talk about ayahs and I talk about the story, and I have people saying, well, I was looked after by an ayah, and then they disappeared and we never saw them again. Right. So I've heard stories about that, and they always wondered, what happened to that lady who took care of me? So it's interesting to hear, but that's what happened. They disappeared, they were dismissed.
Yes.
So the research wasn't easy with both of my books, I would say. But that's why, you know, historical fiction is where you can entertain people and sort of imagine what could have happened in some of their lives. So it's a mixture of truth, you know, real life events and not real as well, but you can sort of combine that to a story.
Yes, and I think that's true of a lot of working class people as well. Their records are very sparse, and it's only things like the Old Bailey records where you do come across details about people's lives and some of the incidents and the crimes also they would have been involved in, because working class history is also quite invisible in this country. So it wouldn't be unusual not to have that kind of detail.
Yeah,
About
very
lots of
interesting. Some of the cases, do go online and have a look. But it's you just some of them are really jaw dropping. Some of the cases, and
Can't
you
believe
think,
it's
wow, yeah. So where it's all recorded, but yes, there are fascinating stories out there.
So I'd like to open it out to the audience, really, if you'd like to ask some questions to Shahida about her work, her book, or any of the topics we've mentioned today.
I would just ask, first of all, thanks for, this was quite good conversation between you and your listeners.
Thank you.
Quite fascinating.
Yes.
You're getting our flavor. Yes, thanks for the reading. It was quite poetic. It came across quite poetic in the first few lines. So my first question is regarding the, yes, you mentioned that you spent around like 10 years. Was that all about doing research and writing and all those? And the second part is, especially with the historical fiction, you have the facts and figures from different sources. But when it's come to dialogues and those kind of description and how you tackle those kind of bits and pieces, those.
Okay. It took me 10 years because I was a bit lazy, I think. I wrote the first draft in 2014, but I sat on it. And it just took me a long, long time to finally complete that. So it was published this year. So I think with the facts and the language, 1901 would be Edwardian England. So I needed to get the language correct, at that time. Some words that were used then, not used now. The language, the way that people would speak, it was more of a proper English in those days. But they also had Cockney as well, didn't they, in Whitechapel? So I think it was just making sure that was accurate. And there were some modern words that I did use, and then my editor said, no, you can't use those words because they didn't exist back over 100 years ago. So, I had to get that historically accurate. But as with any novel writing, it's not easy. It took me a long time. You write the first draft, go through it again, you take out bits and you think, that doesn't work. Even after it was accepted for publication, I still had to rework that. Because obviously publishers know what works with an audience and what doesn't, and what would be interesting. So it's almost like tightening up your story and making sure it's really, really accurate. So I think I didn't expect it to take so long, and I wish I'd finished that earlier. But originally it was called India Inc. That was the first title that I had. She was an artist, and she went around, drawing pictures. But then I thought, no, let me give it a completely new title, an Ayah's Choice. Ayah is sometimes confused with the Arabic word of verses, from the Quran. So it's got nothing to do with that. Ayahs were Indian nannies. So it's that would be the research behind that. It wasn't easy, but I did have to work with historians as well, where they can give me other facts. There was a lady, Dr. Jo Stanley, and she is a historian on maritime history, and she told me and gave me information about Indian ayahs on the ship, and that was really interesting, absolutely fascinating, the research that she did do at that time. So that was, a fantastic help, what she gave me. So just talking to lots of different people and making sure it's completely accurate. But I don't think it's 100% accurate, but as I said, it's a story as well as getting that historical fact right. But thank you for your question.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
Can I ask a bit more about just because obviously I haven't had any experience with it, like kind of what materials you used to try and understand the experiences of the eye, and if you had to read anything to understand the employer, like kind of help understand the dynamics more, or was it just from the point of view of the eye?
Yes, so it's her perspective. It's looking at her life, but also everything that she experienced around it. And it tells you the story of the English family that she was involved with William, his wife Sarah, what they went through, the life that they had, this Ayah coming in, and the struggles that they had. So yes, I think it would, as I said, I needed to look at their lives as well, because it would have been a typical sort of a life of a colonel, because he was a colonel working in British India at the time, and it was very, very common for them to hire nannies to take care of their children. And it was, for these women, they were called mem sahibs because they married the colonels, in India, and they were named mem sahibs. But they also had a struggle. They were in India, the weather wasn't comfortable, it was hot. How did they live in a foreign country? They had to take care of children, the children were born there. So everyone who, around these ayahs also had a struggle, also had a story to tell. So, I wanted to sort of depict that, the relationship, because I had questions asking me, why did you touch on that? I had to touch on that because it was common. It's something I couldn't really admit from my story, where it was common for them to have relationships, even in secret. So I thought, something, to bring that out and for them to understand that they were working as maids. They were almost seen as a servant, but then they had relationships with their employers.
It crossed boundaries. Yes. I mean, it wasn't clear cut servant and master, was it?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't, because obviously for a story to come out like that, a man having a relationship with his servant, it
but
was
also
a big
the children.
no-no.
They had
Yes.
affection for these children, and vice versa. Like you mentioned, people talked about their ayahs. There were some oral recordings of the people who had ayahs in the Hackney Museum exhibition, and recalling the songs in Hindi, the lullabies that were sung to them by the ayahs. And this old English man could recite those, the verses, and sang that song on the oral recording. And he knew words, word for word, of that lullaby. And that shows you how deep that connection was, because he was in his 90s and he still remembered the words of that lullaby that his ayah sang to him when he was a child.
So if you look at a child's perspective, an ayah would almost be like her second mother, because she did everything for that
mother.
child. Yes, because the real mother was on the side, but then the nanny, took care of them. And they had this really close attachment to ayahs. And then they were sent off to boarding school, these young children, and then they wondered, they were so close to these women, and then what happened to them?
And they disappeared, yeah.
They disappeared, yes, but they loved them so much, and they adored them. And I mean, to this day, where I hear from other people, I wish I knew what happened to her.
Yes.
So thank you for your question. I hope that answers that.
Yes, please.
What you're saying now really resonates with me, because my brother-in-law was born in India. His father was a doctor and his mother was a nursing sister, and they came from a long medical family. And he was brought up by his ayah, because his mum did night duty and stuff like that. And he's got Alzheimer's now, and I got him to talk a bit about India, because he never really talks to me. I'm fascinated, and the other day it really came out more from him about the pain he felt when he had to leave India, and he remembered going down to the beach and he was saying throwing stones into the water. I was so angry, I didn't want to go. And the ayah was left behind, but she lived in a Roman Catholic home. And I know Dr. Legg used to send money regularly throughout, her life to help her.
Well, yes, I think.
And I definitely can still speak Gujarati.
Oh wow!
He actually knows some of these nursery rhymes, and he repeated one. He's now in a home, very happily in a home, and he has a lot of access to his family. He can speak it.
That's quite amazing. Quite amazing.
I was thinking about ayahs who were in India, and so important in India. They didn't go on boats to England, but there's a story there, isn't there, about their lives and how some must have been abandoned and others cared for because Eisenstadt was one of them. Yeah.
No, that's lovely to hear. I mean, yes. I mean, not all ayahs were abandoned. You know, some went on to work with other families and went back to India and then travelled back to England again. But most of them were Hindu women and some were Christians. But as I said, it was seen, you know, they were made outcasts because they travelled the Black Oceans. Yes, absolutely. So, but those lullabies, I think, you know, that's amazing. After all these years, that people can still remember. So, yeah. But thank you for sharing that. That's lovely. Yeah.
I read the book, so
Okay.
I'm going to read it now. Just a technical question. What were the contractual statuses of these? It's a form of servitude. I mean, the British invented and took on many different forms of servitude in different parts of the world in different periods. So I'm just curious. Servitude still exists all around the world.
It does. It does.
India,
Yes.
including women, especially women, let's say. But what was it under the British kind of? Obviously, it changed depending on the period. But with the period you're writing, did you come across? Because sometimes it's not clear, sometimes they don't give many contracts, sometimes, you know, they did everything. You know, sometimes they formalised, sometimes they wasn't, sometimes they were semi-slave, really.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of everything, really. I mean, even to this day, we still have maids, you know, in Bangladesh and India, you know, working for upper-class families, yes.
And there's no contract.
So that's not changed.
And there's no, clear terms and conditions.
Under the British, did they have some, or was it formalised? Did you find anything?
Not necessarily. But, so, you know, these women, they put themselves forward. You know, there was a call out for nannies, you know, to help them with lascars. They did have some sort of contract with the ships because they were employed through an agent. So an agent used to take on all these men. So there was a contract there. With ayahs, some women did, but others didn't. But then they just wanted to be able to work and have a better life. So, but, you know, as you said, to this day, you know, we still have these maids. I don't think that's going to go away for
No, there would have been
time.
middlemen and people acting as agents on behalf of both the ayahs and their employers to facilitate that. And I know, like, we had a home in Mr. and Mrs. Rogers' home in Aldgate, and that was also like an employment agency for families going to India. So they could come there and hire an ayah to travel with them to go to India. Now, I don't know what those terms and conditions would have been like, but it was a way of linking up people for employment as well as other experience. But there were always people to facilitate those transactional relationships, actually.
There were Christian missionaries as well who worked with ayahs and lascars.
Yes.
So as you said, middle person, an agent, the homes were a place for them to go to stay. So yes, there was always someone, you know, behind it. They weren't completely left to their own devices, but many did want to return home, and they simply struggled because they didn't have the funds to go home. But that's something we don't really hear about, do we? You know, who were these middle person? What did they do?
Exactly.
But as you said, Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, they did help ayahs.
Yes, they did.
So it'll be interesting to find out, you know, what was their reasoning behind that? Why were they so interested in helping Indian women? Because, as I said earlier, there was a lot of prejudice at the time, but many did want to take care of them and look out for them.
I think both the Ayah's home and possibly Mr. and Mrs. Rogers were Methodists, so it was in their religious background and teaching to do that kind of work. But obviously we don't have enough information about their reasons and how they set that up.
Yeah, but thank you for your question.
Yeah, thanks for saying. Anybody else? Well, I hope it's whet your appetite to read the book, because I couldn't put it down. I had to read the whole thing through. Really, it was great. It was really enjoyable to read it. And also to read it in a way that was, like you say, entertaining, kept me hooked and gave me an understanding of what it could have been like. And I was fascinated to find out about her her adventures really when she got to London, because she did end up meeting Sylvia Pankhurst, and it was just extraordinary, because you just think, oh wow, you know, it's connecting the lives of the people here as well as the lives of people in India.
Yeah, so lots of action and adventure.
Yes.
But that's for you to all find out.
Yes, to find out when you read the book.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank Shahida for coming today with her son all the way from Cambridge and to speaking to us about her book and to answer your questions and to have this amazing conversation. I'm really pleased that we managed to do this.
Thank you. Thank you for all coming and listening to me today.